Okay guys, hoping you're well, hoping your weekend has gone well. I'm not sure you'll be able to watch this tonight or if you'll only see it on Monday night. But just to walk you through a little bit what we're going to be doing, we're going to be looking at the Gemara together. The Gemara, the Rashi, and one of the Tosafos. And hopefully it will help you reviewing and help you in your reading of this Gemara. So buckle up and good luck. So again, we're talking about renting on Erev Pesach, where a person's coming to rent for the first time. They arrive in the house. It's Erev Pesach. It's Yud Daled at night, and the question is, who's going to have to do the bedikas Chometz? Who's going to have to do the search for the Chometz inside? Before we see the Gemara inside, just to define some terms, we are familiar with the words masker and socher, just to make sure that everyone understands, what that really is. Again, maskir, just to understand, a maskir is different than a socher, and please understand the difference. A maskir is the landlord, and that is, a maskir bayis, someone is a landlord. So, understand that when the Gemara talks about a maskir, it's talking about the landlord, as opposed to the socher is the renter. So when the Gemara is asking the question, maskir and socher, make sure you have these terms clear. Maskir, again, is the landlord. Socher is the tenant, the renter. Let's begin the Gemara. Bo minei me Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. They asked a question of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Hamaskir bayis lechavero be'arba'asar. If a person rents to his friend a home on the 14th at night, al mi livdok, who is obligated to check for Chometz? Al hamasker livdok, de chamira didehu, is the obligation on the landlord to check, since the Chometz is his. It is his house, and it's his Chometz. O dilma, or maybe al asocher livdok, the obligation is on the renter, the tenant, to check the isur birshu sekai, because the isur, that which is prohibited, the chametz, is in his possession. Right now, it's near him. It's in his property. Again, is the obligation on the maskir because it is his chametz, or is the obligation on the socher since the isur is currently in his possession? The Gemara attempts an answer. The answer will begin with the attempted proof will begin with the word tashma. But before we see the tashma, let's just see the next Rashis. Rashi explains the first side of the question of the chamir didehu, that the chametz belongs to the maskir. Shachametz shebebayis shalohu. The chametz is his, explains Rashi. What that means is, since the chametz in his house is his. Obviously, a person is renting a house from someone else. Any chametz that is found in that house belongs to the landlord. Rashi continues, explaining the next phrase, Bishu Sekai, is explaining the Gemara that said that the obligation is on the renter, on the tenant, since the Isser is in his possession. As Rashi explains, what does it mean, Bishu Sekai? Share'ata habayis shelo. Rashi says, right now, when you rent from a landlord, right now that house is yours. And therefore, maybe the obligation to check should be on the one who right now has temporary ownership of that house, and therefore the obligation should be on the renter. Who is obligated? So the Gemara goes back and focuses on the Gemara goes back to focus on the Brisa. The Gemara wants to answer the question by proving the answer from the following Brisa, Tashma. Come and listen to the following proof. Hamasker bayis l'chavero al hasocher laslos lo mezuzah. If a person rents a house from his friend, the obligation is on the renter to make a mezuzah. So the Gemara wants to prove from the fact that we find that a person, if he rents an apartment, the obligation is on the renter and not on the landlord. That clearly proves that if the tenant has to put up the mezuzah, the Gemara thinks at this point, just like he has to do that mitzvah, he's also going to have to do the mitzvah of b'dikas chometz. Just like when it's your apartment that you're renting it, you're obligated to do the mitzvah of putting a mezuzah, so too it's probably also your obligation when it comes to doing b'dikas chometz, checking for chometz. However, in the next line, the Gemara rejects that proof. Hasam ha'amar of Masharshia, mezuzah chovas hadarhi. Over there, by mezuzah, didn't Rav Masharshia say that a mezuzah is an obligation of the one who lives there? Hachamai. But here, by b'dikas chametz, by searching for chametz, what's the law? Rashi explains that by mezuzah it makes sense that, of course, the one putting up the mezuzah is the renter. Cholas hadar, lefi shi mishamarto. It's the obligation of the one who lives there because the mezuzah protects a person living there. And therefore, of course, the obligation is not going to be on the landlord to put up mezuzah to protect. If anyone, it should be the one who's living there. Furthermore, says Rashi, uksiv beisecha, and it says in the pasuk, you put a mezuzah on your house. And Rashi expounds, he gives a drasha to explain what that means. Bi'asecha, beisecha could also be read as bi'asecha, a place of your comings, nichnas v'yotziba, where you go into and come out of. Meaning, the obligation of the Torah of putting mezuzah is only on a place where you're going constantly in and out of. However, the landlord who's not living there would be exempt from it. But that's only an obligation for mezuzah. Aval hacha, but over here, by b'dikas chametz derabanan. B'dikas chametz, searching for chametz, is an obligation only from the rabbis. The imishum bal yira bal yimatzeh, because if the reason why we're checking for chametz is to avoid the prohibition of finding chametz or seeing chametz, ha'amar lakaman desagi b'tobama. We see in the Gemara later on that's enough just to do bittul. If you remove it from your mind, umashri leka'afra, and you make the chametz like dust, you make it in your heart, in your mind, valueless. Amar kol chamira beis haden, you say the words kol chamira, all the leaven, all the bread in my house should be like afra da'ara, should be nullified, should be worthless. So if you did that already, you're not going to be violating the Isser of Bal Yira. V'Rabbanan hu da'atzrich b'dika. The only reason why I'm doing b'dika is not because of the Torah, it's because the rabbis required me to do b'dika. Seemingly, so I shouldn't come to eat it. V'hashta ki hai gavna mibayalan. And here in our Gemara, we're asking, Toreach amimuto, the burden, the obligation of checking on whom does it rest. So Rashi's telling us that clearly, you can't bring a proof from mezuzah. Mezuzah is fundamentally different. Mezuzah, we have the obligation is clearly on the renter, since A, it protects him, and B, the Torah writes beisecha, which we read as biasecha, in a place where you're coming in and out of, that's where you're obligated to put a mezuzah. However, by b'dikas chametz, you're not going to need to, the renter is not going to need to even do b'dika from the Torah, since Rashi's telling me here, that all of a sudden he's telling me, that already bittul has been done. It's already been nullified. So the only thing we're discussing here is really the obligation of checking, according to the rabbis, who is going to be responsible. Should it be the renter, or should it be the landlord? And that's the question of our Gemara. Our Gemara is not asking a question from the Torah, who has to check. It's asking, once you already did bittul, who has to check? The renter, or the landlord? So the Gemara gives a conclusion. Amar lahu Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, who was originally the one asked the question, he said back to them, Tanina, we learned in a brisa, Hamasker bayis lechavero, if a person rents a house to his friend, Im ad shelo masalo maftachos, chal arba asar al hamasker livdok. So if the 14th arrived before he had a chance to hand over the keys, then the obligation is on the landlord to check, the masker. Im shemasar lo maftechos, chal arba asar al hasocher livdok. if the 14th arrived after he handed the keys, then the obligation is on the renter to check. In other words, if the keys were handed over before the 14th, if he got the keys on the 13th, let's say, the obligation to check would be on the socher, on the tenant. But if he waited and only handed it over on the 14th, the obligation to check would be on the maskir, would be on the landlord. And that is the answer to our question. We open to the question to ask who's obligated to check. Is it the maskir? Is it the socher? In the end of the day, it all comes down to the keys. Who got the keys? At what time did they get it? Did they get it early enough on the 13th, or did they wait to the 14th? If they got it early enough, the obligation is on the renter, on the tenant, but otherwise the obligation is on the landlord. Then Rashi, explaining why handing the keys matters, says something interesting. Mesiras Mafteach, says Rashi, Hu kinyan haschiros. The giving over of the keys is the acquisition, is the kinyan. It's what makes the house belong to the renter. Rashi is telling me something new that we never knew before. That handing over keys is another form of kinyan, of an act of acquisition. Just as I can lift something up in order to acquire something, I could do an act of hagbah or mashiach. I could pull something, it makes something, it shows that it's mine. I can hand the keys over to the renter, and that shows that the house now belongs to the renter. And that is why it matters, the handing of the keys. Rashi further explains, Bim'ad shelo masar mafteach, if you didn't hand over the keys, nichtas lel abasar, the 14th already came, it already began, then then the obligation of checking falls on the landlord, since the property was still in his possession. And even though he already handed over the keys during the day, already the obligation to check began on the landlord. So Rashi explains it's all about the kinyan. Who's in possession of this property? As soon as you hand the keys over, it's not yours anymore. And ultimately, since in this case the landlord has the keys on the day of the 14th, therefore he's still obligated to check. Tosfos, on the other hand, doesn't really like this. Tosfos is one of the last Tosfos on the page. In Mishemasar Mafteach, Perish Rashi. Rashi explained what it means, why handing over the keys matters. The Mesiras Maftechos Kona. Because handing over the keys is a kinyan. Handing over the keys is a method of acquiring, and that is the way to give over the property from the landlord to the tenant. V'ein nira l'ri. Tosfos argues on Rashi, saying, it doesn't appear to me, to the Rabbeinu Yitzchak, that he is correct. Deha, because Amar b'Meruba, it says in the Gemara in Perek Meruba, it's the name of a chapter in Baba Kama, Kishem shekarka niknas b'kesef b'shtar u'b'chazaka, kach sichiras karka nikne b'kesef, and the Gemara continues, shtar and chazaka. The Gemara describes Kishem, just like karka, land, niknes is acquired through kesef, giving over money, shtar, signing a contract. You can give property through a document, and chazaka, by living in a property for 3 years, that shows ownership. So too, kach, schirus, renting karka, renting property, nikne, can be acquired through those 3 ways, through kesef, through shtar, and chazaka. So clearly the Gemara is giving me all the ways to acquire property, and doesn't mention anything about this idea called giving over keys. It doesn't say that it helps giving over keys to give over land, give over property. We'll skip the next 2 lines. So clearly, says Tosfos, giving over keys is not a way to acquire property. Mefarish Ri. Therefore, the Ri explains, Rabbi Yitzchak explains, why does it matter who has the keys? A different explanation. In our case we're dealing with is a case where you gave over the keys, but you didn't do a chazaka. You didn't acquire the property. However, someone who has in his hands the keys, kishachal yadalid, when the 14th begins, chayav livdok, he's obligated to check. Because the person who does not have the keys, how is he supposed to come in and check? So Tosfos is saying, it's not because the land belongs to the person who has the keys, it's a practical thing. You only have the ability to check if you have the keys. So since, in this case, whoever has the keys on the 14th is the only one who's able to check, that's why he's obligated to check. But if, right, umiyu, says Tosfos, im hifkid adam mafteach beso etzel adam acher, eino chayav hanifkad lebodko. If you put the keys in a person's house, in a different person, there's another set of keys, then the person who's watching these keys, he's not obligated to check. It's only exclusively when a person wants to acquire the house and rent it, and he has the keys, that's when he'd be obligated to check. So in summary, Tosfos explains, unlike Rashi, that the reason why having the keys matters is because if you have the keys, you have the ability to enter. And that's why you're obligated to check. But not because it's a kinyan. According to Tosfos, keys is not a way of giving over property, but it does simply, the one who has the keys has the ability to enter the property, and he has the ability to check, and that is why he's obligated.